Hello, my name is Gopala Vasudevan, and today we're going to talk about Chapter 1, Multinational Financial Management. Now, what are some of the things we cover today? We'll talk about the goals of the company, and we'll talk about the organizational structure. We'll talk about some of the reasons why companies go abroad, and most of these are based upon economics. We'll talk about the common ways companies use to conduct international business. And finally, we'll talk about a model for valuing the MNC. Okay? So first of all, when you look at a company, when you look at how it engages in international business, there are several ways you can do that. So the first thing you see here is that whenever you are a multinational corporation, whatever you do, you have to interact with the financial markets. So what does it mean? Basically, it means that you could be basically dealing in the product markets. So what that means is that you might be a company like Apple. You are selling your computers, you are selling your iPhones, and so on. So that would be the product market. And you might be exporting and importing your products. So let's say you're a Walmart. You might be importing your products from China, India, Bangladesh, and other countries. The second is you might have subsidiaries in those countries. So if you look at companies like Oracle or Google, they tend to have subsidiaries in different parts of the world. They have subsidiaries in Ireland, in England, in China, India, South America, and so on. So that would be a second way they go abroad. That is, they have established subsidiaries and they deal with those subsidiaries. Now, the third reason why companies go abroad is because they want to raise money. So as an example, recently in 2015, Alibaba had a huge public offering. So that was around 25 billion. And basically for Alibaba, they are a Chinese company, but they wanted to access capital in the financial market. So that is why they did this big IPO. Otherwise, companies from abroad might come to the US, for example, to list their stock, like Mercedes-Benz is one example. They might also come to the US and also other markets to raise money by issuing bonds. Now, why do they do that? There are several reasons why companies might do that. The first is the offering could be so big that they want to make sure that they can sell the stock or the bonds as quickly as possible. So that is what happened in the case of Alibaba. Now, let's talk about the way you do business, whether you have a centralized management or whether you have a decentralized management. So Exhibit 1.1 here, that talks about a company that has a very centralized management. Now, if you talk about the main functions of a company, the main functions of a company typically when you look at the financial functions are the cash management. The second is inventory and accounts receivable management. So sometimes that is referred to as working capital management. Then we have the financing decision. We have the investment decision, which is the capital expenditures. So these are the main functions. So we have working capital management, financing decision, and the investment decision. So in this case, you have a parent company. Let's say that's a US company that has subsidiaries in Europe and it has subsidiaries in Asia. So let's say A is the European subsidiaries and B is the Asian subsidiaries. Now what we see here is that for all of the major decisions, whether that is a working capital management decision, whether it's a financing decision, or whether it is a capital expenditure decision, all these decisions have to be processed by the subsidiary only after it has been approved by the parent company. So there we have a very centralized multinational company. Now if you go to the other side, we have a very decentralized company. In this case of a decentralized company, what we see is that the three main functions we talked about, the cash management, the inventory and accounts receivable management, and the capital expenditures management. So all of the main decisions here, all of them have been conducted by the subsidiary itself. So in this case, the parent really leaves all these decisions to the subsidiary. So that's an example of a decentralized management. So for both A and B, the capital investment decision, the financing decision, and the inventory and accounts receivable management are done by the subsidiaries A and subsidiaries B. Now, what we might see in practice is somewhere in the middle, And in that case, what we are saying is that some of the key decisions up to a certain amount can be decided by the subsidiary. But after a certain amount, those decisions have to be ratified by the parent company. So that is what we might see in practice. So as an example, if you talk about Ford, Ford has divisions in Europe, it has in Asia, it has in South America, and so on. So what a company like Ford might do is that up to $10 million, the subsidiaries can make their decision. After that, they have to seek the approval of the parent company. So that way, the parent company does not worry about the small day-to-day decisions, but when it comes to bigger decisions, they have to be approved by the parent company. Okay. Now, we want to talk about the agency problem. So what is the agency problem? Typically, what is the agency problem is a case where you have the shareholders. So the shareholders are the owners of the company. They typically appoint the managers to run the company on their behalf. Now, if you are a manager, your incentives could be different from those of the owners. And the reason being that you are concerned about your paycheck, you are concerned about your retirement, you are concerned about your vacation, and so on. Your sole interest might not be to increase the value of the stock or to increase the money that comes to the shareholders. So in this case, that is referred to as an agency conflict. And basically here, what we are saying is that the objectives of the managers and of the shareholders tend to be different. For shareholders, the main objective is to increase firm value or to increase the share price. For the managers, the main decision would be, what's there for me? How do I maximize my benefits? Now, how can we control this? The first one is agency conflicts can be reduced by parent control of agency problems. So what that means is that the parent will make sure that the managers of the subsidiaries do the best to increase the value of the firm rather than to increase the value of their subsidiaries. And again, the parent can step in when they find that things are not good at the subsidiary. So some examples are in the case of Yahoo and Alibaba. Alibaba is a large company based in China, and Yahoo used to be one of their major shareholders. So Yahoo owned, I don't know, about 50% of Alibaba, and in recent times, if you look at Yahoo stock, the main value of the stock comes from the ownership in Alibaba. Now, what is the conflict here? The conflict here was the CEO of Alibaba, whose name is Jack Ma. He basically sold a large subsidiary that belonged to Alibaba to himself. And that subsidiary, the name of that is Alipay. Now, in this case, Yahoo did not like that. The reason being that for Yahoo, they are losing part of their investment. And there was a big conflict between the parent company or the main company, that is Yahoo, and their investment, which is Alibaba. Okay. Now, the third way you can try to bring down the agency conflict is through compensation plan. Now, what does it mean? Basically, what that tells you is that if you look at a company like Apple, when CEO Cook came into place, he was given $400 million worth of stock and stock options. And if you look at how they paid, basically they paid the CEO not with cash, because if you give him cash, he has no incentive to work harder. On the other hand, if you pay him with stock and stock options, he will do his best to make sure that the value of the company is increased, because only if the value of the company is increased does his compensation go up. So that is what is meant by the compensation plans that can be used to reduce the conflict of interest. Now, what else do you see here? Corporate control of agency problems. Now here what you see is that outsiders can buy the firm at depressed prices. So here what we are saying is that whenever the value of the firm goes down, perhaps due to mismanagement, there is a chance that people from outside, so you have hedge funds, private equity investors, and so on, they really like to buy stock when the stock is going down, and especially when they believe that they can turn around the firm. So if you are a manager, you will try to do your best to make sure that the firm's stock price does not go down very much, because you know that you might lose control and you might be fired. So here, some of the examples of the activist investors who do things like that are hedge funds, mutual funds. Now, not only do they try to buy the firm's stock at reduced prices, but once they find that the company is not being well managed and the share price is down, they can also seek to buy a certain amount of stock, and then they can force the management to change their policies to make sure that they do things that will increase the firm value. Okay. Now, in the US, perhaps one of the biggest legislation that took place was the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002. Now, what does it mean? Basically here, it requires firms to implement an internal reporting process that can be easily monitored by executives. And it also makes executives more accountable for financial statements by personally verifying their accuracy. So what we see here is that because of some of the mismanagement that took place at companies like Enron, MCI, WorldCom, and so on, where there were a lot of accounting irregularities, the legislature in the US, they decided to come up with some rules that would prohibit or that would make it more difficult for managers to do such things, and they would be personally responsible for any of those actions. So here, by signing off on the financial statements, the CEOs and other top executives are personally responsible. And by doing that, the government is hoping that there will be less mismanagement, there will be less falsification of records, and so on. So that is the good part of having the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. Now, what is the bad part? The bad part is that sometimes companies from abroad, they might not want to be listed in the US. And the reason being that they do not want to meet the more stringent accounting requirements in the US. Perhaps it might dissuade the bad firms rather than the good firms, but that is always a concern. And the second one is that you also have a lot of firms in the US, those tend to be startup firms. Now, previously, all those firms, when they grow to a certain size, they all would like to be listed in the US exchange. But because of these higher listing requirements, what we find is that rather than be listed, those firms would prefer to be bought out by other bigger companies, simply because they don't want to spend all this money to meet those accounting requirements, and the CEOs and other people don't want to be personally responsible for the financial statements. Now, we want to talk about some of the reasons why companies go abroad. And some of the reasons why companies go abroad, the first one is the theory of competitive advantage. So what does it mean here? Basically, what we are saying is that different countries are good at certain specific things. So as an example, in the US, there is a lot of emphasis on creativity. So when we are in kindergarten, when we are in middle school, when we are in high school, and so on, typically the projects we tend to do does emphasize creativity. Now, in this case, if you go to a country like China, what we find is that China definitely has an advantage when compared to the US, and that is they have lower cost labor. They also have labor that is quite good. So that the advantage you see for China is that they have high quality, low cost labor when compared with the US. Now, if you go to Germany, Germany is very well known for their engineering. Now, what is the disadvantage? The disadvantage is that they tend to have high cost. So what we see here is that in the case of Apple, which is a US company, they do all the designing in the US. At the same time, when it comes to manufacturing, they go to China. If you look at Sony, Sony is a Japanese company. They again are very good at engineering, but manufacturing costs are very high in Japan. So again, what you see is that a company like Sony, they do the design in Japan and they do the manufacturing in a lower cost country such as Malaysia. If you look at Volkswagen, again, what they do is they do the design in Germany, and the actual manufacturing they might prefer to have in a lower cost country such as Mexico when they sell cars in the US. So in all these cases, this talks about the theory of competitive advantage, which basically says that companies should be specializing in certain activities, and then they should be doing the other activities in other countries that might have a competitive advantage. Okay? Now, the second reason why companies pursue international business is based upon the imperfect markets theory. Now, what is the imperfect markets theory? The factors of production are somewhat immobile, providing incentive to seek out foreign opportunities. So, as an example, Europe, people buy a lot of cars, but at the same time, the European governments, they restrict the free import of cars, especially from Japan. So to get around this, what some of the Japanese companies have done is that they have set up manufacturing opportunities in Europe. So by doing that, they are able to get around some of the restrictions made on them by the European governments. Now the same thing happens in the US. You have a lot of car companies setting up manufacturing in the US. And again, one of the reasons why they do that is because they want to avoid the quotas placed on them. They also want to avoid some of the barriers to entry. Okay. Now the third reason why companies go abroad is based upon the product cycle theory. And what does it say here? Basically, what we see here is that as a firm matures, it recognizes opportunities outside the domestic market. So as an example, if you look at a company like Whirlpool or a company like GE, which makes items like dishwashers, washer dryers, and so on, what we find is that they do initially they sold their products in the US, but over time the market for such products has become saturated in the US. But at the same time, if you go to a country like China, we find that there are a lot of opportunities in China and in India. The reason being that these countries have a growing middle class, and a lot of these middle class do not have access to all these things we talk about, such as dishwashers, washer dryers, and so on. So that is one of the reasons why these companies try to set up operations abroad, and they also tend to export their products to these countries. Okay. Now, what do we see in practice when you look at an international product life cycle? Basically, what we find here is that the firm creates product to accommodate the local demand. The firm exports product to accommodate the foreign demand. So if you look at Apple, initially they try to sell their phones in the US, but very quickly they export their products to Europe, China, and other places. And in the next step, what companies might do is that they establish a foreign subsidiary to establish a presence in foreign country and possibly to reduce costs. Now, this is especially true in the case of manufacturing, such as car companies or any other devices. And if you look at Dell, Dell exports a lot of computers to China, India, and so on. And over time, you have operations like Dell India, Dell China, and so on. So there, basically, that is an example of the product life cycle. Now, what we find here is that in the case of the product life cycle, initially the firm does well. The firm is able to differentiate their product from competitors. But over time, as we have a larger presence in a foreign country, it becomes more and more difficult to differentiate your product, and that competitive advantage will be eliminated over time. Now, when you look at how firms engage in international business, usually what you find is that initially they do international trade, and basically they either export their products to outside countries or they import their products from outside countries. Now, why do they do that? The main reason is that it is a lower cost way, and it's also a conservative way. So they have lower initial investment, and they also tend to be more conservative. Basically what that means is that if things don't work out, they can immediately close their business because they did not have any big investments. So one example is Walmart. Walmart imports a lot of products from China and other countries, and most of the time they do it through international trade. Now, the second way firms engage in international business is by licensing, and here allows firms to use their technology in foreign countries without major investments. So typically you might find that pharmaceutical companies, that could be a US company, they do a lot of R&D here, and it's a very capital intensive investment. But they also have a lot of investment in manufacturing. Now, they don't want to set up the same facilities in other countries. Rather than do that, they might allow the foreign pharmaceutical companies to get a license from the US company. So this way, the US based company which came up with the medicine or the drug gets some fees from the foreign companies, but at the same time they do not have to make this major investment. What is the third way they engage in international business? That is through franchising. So firm provides sales service support in exchange for fees. Now you see companies like McDonald's and Subway, they are all over the world, and usually the way they expand is through franchising. So they basically team up with foreign nationals and they basically make them franchisees. Now a fourth way they can do business is by joint venture. So for example, if you look at GM, they go to China, they go to a lot of other countries, and especially in China, the Chinese government says that GM or any other car manufacturer is not allowed to open operations directly. They always should have a local partner, and in this case what we see is that the business is set up between the US based company, which is GM, and a local partner that could be somebody like Geely Automotive and so on. Okay. Fifth way is by acquisitions of existing operations. So what does it mean? If you look at a company like Honda, when they came to India initially, they had a local partner, and that was, I think, Hero motorcycles. Okay, but after some time, Honda was very successful, especially in selling scooters and so on. So what they decided to do was they decided that they want to have full control over the operations, and in this case they bought out their local partner and then they established Honda India. So this is an example where initially they got a foothold in the market by having a local partner, and after some time they basically decided that they want to do it by themselves. Okay. The sixth way is by establishing new foreign subsidiaries. So if you look at companies like Oracle, Citicorp and so on, they tend to have subsidiaries in different countries. Now why does Citicorp do that? The main reason is that Citicorp is a bank, and typically it's a very highly regulated company, which basically means that when they go to a foreign country, that could be the Middle East, that could be China, that could be India, that could be Europe, if they try to compete against local banks and they still have to follow the US rules, it makes them less competitive. So by having a foreign subsidiary which has to obey the foreign laws rather than the US laws, it helps them compete effectively. Okay. Now what we have here is that it talks about international trade by the MNC, and in this case MNC imports inflows from exporting. So if they sold products abroad, so that could be a Microsoft or that could be an Apple, they basically sell their products abroad and they receive the cash inflows. Or if you look at a company such as Walmart, which is mainly an importer, they have to pay the money and then they basically receive the money from their receive the products. Okay. Now if you look at licensing, franchising and joint ventures, what we see is that it could be a pharmaceutical company, or it could be a company such as Subway or Pizza Hut. What they do is that they receive cash from providing the services, or they have to pay for the service received from abroad. So this is what we see here. We have an MNC and we have a foreign firm or a government agency. So there are cash inflows from the services provided or cash outflows for the services received. And the last one is investments in foreign subsidiaries by the MNC. And what we see here is that the MNC establishes a subsidiary in the foreign country. So that could be BMW establishing operations in the US, and the local subsidiary, that is a US subsidiary of BMW, manufactures cars in the US and sells them in the US. So a big portion of the money they receive goes back to the German parent company, that is the BMW Germany. Now if they are also have to invest in the foreign subsidiary, you will see that there are cash outflows to finance the operations. So what we see here is that we started with the easiest way to set up business abroad, and that is by importing or by exporting. The second one is licensing, franchising, or joint ventures. They have to make a bigger investment. they also try to share risk between the parent company and the franchisee or the local partner. And the most intensive capital wise is the subsidiary. And in this case, what we find is that most of the risk is borne by the parent company because they make the big investment and they are also taking on 100% of the risk. So we want to talk about some of the examples we have here. The first one, Dewey Incorporated decides to penetrate the Spanish market with either a licensing arrangement or by acquiring a foreign firm. Which is better if the product is successful, which is riskier? So what we find here is that in this case, if the product is successful, you are always better off by acquiring a foreign firm. And the reason being that if the product is successful, you get to keep 100% of the profits. If it's a licensing arrangement, you only get maybe 10% or 20% of the profits. Now, which is riskier? Obviously, the riskier project is where if you are acquiring the foreign firm. And the reason being that you have to pay a lot of money to buy this firm and all the risk is now entirely borne by you. Now, the second one, Snyder Golf, a US firm that sells high quality golf clubs in the US, wants to expand to Brazil. Should the firm export, license, or set up a subsidiary? So, if you look at the three choices, what we will say here is that if they're not going to sell too many golf clubs, it's better off to export. On the other hand, if they're confident that the market is going to be really good, perhaps they might want to establish a subsidiary. And why should they do that? The main reason being that perhaps they can manufacture at a lower cost and in Brazil, and although they might have to spend a lot of money up front, it might be worthwhile because they get a good market, they can sell their products to, and they can also manufacture at a lower cost. Okay. Now let's look at another example. Carly's Company is a US firm that is about to purchase a large company in Switzerland at a purchase price of 20 million. This company produces furniture and sells it locally, and it is expected to earn large profits every year. The company will become a subsidiary of Carly's and will periodically remit the excess cash flows due to its profits to Carly's Company. Assume that Carly's Company has no other international business. Carly's has 10 million that it will use to pay for part of the Swiss company and will finance the rest of the purchase with borrowed dollars. Okay. Now, Carly's can obtain supplies from either a US supplier or a Swiss supplier. Both suppliers are very reputable and there would be no exposure to country risk when using either supplier. Is the valuation of the total cash flows more uncertain if it obtains a supplies from a US firm or a Swiss firm? Okay. So let's go back to the question. So basically here, it's a US firm manufacturing furniture in Switzerland and selling it locally. Okay. So what we find here is that all the revenues are coming from Switzerland. And in this case, if they buy their raw materials or whatever supplies from a US supplier, what might happen is that the revenues are in Swiss currency while their cost of goods sold is in US dollars. On the other hand, if they sell in Switzerland and deal with a Swiss supplier, the benefit is that both their revenues and their cost of goods sold are in Swiss francs. Typically, what that means is that there's a high chance that their overall risk will be lower if they deal with a Swiss supplier rather than with a US supplier. Okay. Now what we see here is that it talks about the valuation model for an MNC, and what we see here is that what it tells you is that the value of a company is the present value of the cash flows. What it tells you here is that T equals 1 to n, the expected cash flow at time t, divided by 1 plus k raised to t. So here k stands for the required rate of return. Usually for a company that stands for the weighted average cost of capital. So what we are saying here is that the value of the firm is the present value of the future cash flows. So we need two things. We need to find out the cash flows and we need to find out the cost of capital. Okay. So when you look at this model, it tells you that you can increase the firm value in two ways. One is by increasing the future cash flows, that is by choosing the right investments, and the second way is by decreasing the cost of capital. So how do we decrease the cost of capital? By choosing the right way to finance the business. So by using the right mix of bonds and stocks. Now what happens when a company goes abroad? So for example, if you're a company like Microsoft, you get paid in different currencies. You get paid in US dollars, you get paid in euros, you get paid in British pounds, in Indian rupees, Chinese yuan, and so on. So what do they have to worry about? When you look at the expected cash flows, there are two parts to that. That is the cash flows in the foreign currency, and they also have to look at what is going to be the expected spot rate at that time. So whenever we talk about a valuation model for an MNC, we not only have to worry about the future cash flows, we also have to be concerned about what is going to be the expected spot rate. And the reason being that if we expect the euro to appreciate, that is going to help the US company because they get more in US dollars. On the other hand, in recent times we have seen that the US dollar has strengthened against a lot of other currencies. In that case, what that tells you is that they get less money when they convert the foreign currency back into US dollars. Okay. So what are some of the reasons why the cash flows can become uncertain? The first is exposure to international economic conditions. So economy in foreign countries decline, it can affect the cash flow. So that is what we saw in recent times. In the recent times, the European countries have not been doing well, and overall their economies have declined, and the value of the euro has also declined relative to the US, which basically means that companies in the US that are exporting a lot to Europe have suffered. Their revenues have gone down and their profits also have gone down. The second is exposure to international political risk, and here increased taxes or imposed barriers. So again, what we find is that sometimes either due to political reasons or otherwise, foreign governments can put restrictions on importing from other countries. So Venezuela did that in recent times, and Russia has also been doing that in recent times. So that is a source of risk for the US firm that is exporting the products to the foreign country. And the third one is exposure to exchange rate risk. And what we are seeing here is that if you are a US exporter, a decrease in the value of the foreign currency, or whenever the US dollar gets stronger, it's going to hurt the US company. On the other hand, if you're a company that's importing products from abroad, such as Walmart, an increase in the value of the US dollar will help that company. Okay. Now, what are the structure of the remaining chapters? So what we see here is that initially we're going to talk about the big picture. So we're going to talk about today we talked about some of the reasons why companies go abroad. We talked about the ways in which you can set up their business, and we also talked about the agency problem. Okay. Now in chapter 2 we'll talk about the international flow of funds. In chapter 3 we'll talk about the foreign currency markets, and so on. So chapters 2 to 5 they give you a background on the international financial market. So there we are looking at the big picture as far as the world is concerned, and especially as far as the international financial markets are concerned. Now after that, what we do is that chapters 6 to 8 they talk about the exchange rate behavior. So in chapters 6 to 8 what we do is that we'll talk about some of the rules regarding exchange rates. So we'll talk about the interest rate parity, we will talk about the international Fisher effect, and we'll talk about how companies can profit from any mispricing. So that is referred to as arbitrage. Chapters 9 to 12 it talks about exchange rate risk management. So what that means is that if you are a multinational, what are some of the ways in which you can control your exposure to exchange rates? Now chapters 13 to 18 that talks about the long-term investment and financing decisions, and it also deals with the risk and return of an MNC. So what we see here is that when you put both of these together, so we talked about the cash flows and we talked about exchange rates. So both of them can affect the future cash flows. And we also talked about the short-term investment and financing decisions. So the firm's decisions where to keep the money they get from their business abroad. So right now, if you look at US firms, they have almost $1 trillion lying outside the country. And the reason why they don't want to bring it to the US is because when they bring their money back to the US, they will be taxed at a high rate. So to avoid this, they want to keep their money abroad. And sometimes firms also decide to raise money by issuing bonds and stocks outside their home country. So we talked about Alibaba issuing stock in the US. Again, you might have a lot of companies from China and so on issuing bonds in the US. Now, the reason why they want to do that is because they want to bring down their cost of financing. And by bringing down the cost of financing, they are able to bring down their cost of capital. Now, I just want to talk about a couple more examples here. So the first one, it talks about Anheuser-Busch, the producer of Budweiser and other beers. They expanded into Japan by engaging in a joint venture with Kirin Brewery, the largest brewery in Japan. The joint venture enables Anheuser-Busch to have its beer distributed through Kirin's distribution channels in Japan. In addition, it could utilize Kirin's facilities to produce beer that would be sold locally. In return, Anheuser-Busch provided information about the American beer market to Kirin. So it talks about the strategy that Anheuser-Busch is adopting by going abroad, and by doing that, they are partnering with a foreign company, that is Kirin Brewery. Now, why do they do that? The main reason why they do that is because by engaging in a partnership, they are able to produce their beer using Kirin's facilities. And in return, what is Anheuser-Busch doing? What Anheuser-Busch is doing is that they are providing information about the American beer market to Kirin. So in this partnership, Anheuser-Busch gets manufacturing facilities in Japan through Kirin, and in turn, Anheuser-Busch is providing knowledge about the US market to Kirin. Okay? So how do they each achieve their objective of maximizing the shareholder wealth? So how do they do that? By having this joint venture, it enabled Anheuser-Busch to distribute Budweiser throughout Japan, and this was achieved without a significant investment. So there are two things that Anheuser-Busch achieved. The first was they were able to use Kirin Brewery's distribution network. And usually it's very difficult to start from scratch and establish the distribution network. The second is that they also could use Kirin Brewery's manufacturing facilities to produce the beer. And typically, to establish a manufacturing facility needs a very significant investment. And they were able to avoid that by having the partnership with Kirin. Okay. Now, explain how the joint venture limited the risk of the international business. So what we see here is that the biggest investments tend to be for manufacturing and for establishing a distribution network. And for Anheuser-Busch, they were able to achieve both of these by having this partnership with Kirin Beer. Okay. Now, many international ventures are intended to circumvent barriers that normally prevent foreign competition. What barrier in Japan did Anheuser-Busch circumvent as a result of the joint venture? What barrier in the US did Kirin circumvent as a result of the joint venture? So as far as Anheuser-Busch is concerned, they were able to access the distribution system, which is very difficult to establish and which is also not accessible, especially to foreign companies. Now, what is the risk they face? The risk they face is that by giving their know-how as far as the US market is concerned to Kirin Beer, perhaps they're giving their secrets away to a foreign competitor who might be able to use that to compete effectively, not only in the US markets, but perhaps in other markets all over the world. Now, this question, it talks about the impact of exchange rates on MNC. And what we have here is, we have a company based in Poland. The company's name is Olmsted, and it has small computer chips assembled in Poland and transports the final assembled product to the parent, where they are sold in the US. So Olmsted is primarily a US-based company that has established a subsidiary in Poland. And they basically assemble the computer chips together and they export it back to the US. The assembled products are invoiced in dollars. It uses Polish currency to produce these chips and assembles them in Poland. The Polish subsidiary pays the employees in the local currency. Olmsted Company finances the subsidiary operation with loan from a Polish bank. The parent of Olmsted will send sufficient payments in dollars to the subsidiary in order to repay the loan and other expenses incurred by the subsidiary. If the Polish subsidiary zloty depreciates against the dollar, will that have a favorable, unfavorable, or neutral effect on the value of Olmsted? Briefly explain. So if you look at this example, we can basically separate the two parts as far as Olmsted is concerned, and that is the revenues and the cost. Now if you look at the revenues, basically the revenues come in US dollars because they sell their product in the US and it's invoiced in dollars. Now if you look at the cost of goods sold, what we find is that the cost of goods sold here is, one is the chips, the second is labor, and the third is the cost of financing. Okay, so if you look at the subsidiary operations, they are financed with loans from a Polish bank, so in local currency. Okay, so that is in foreign currency, and to repay the loan and other expenses, the parent company sends the money in dollars. So what we find here is that if the Polish zloty depreciates against the dollar, that is going to help the Olmsted Company. And the reason being that they need fewer dollars to pay the expenses. Okay, so that is going to benefit the parent company. Okay, so here today